In the winter of 1864, the United States Army gave an impossible order to the Navajo people. Leave your homeland. Walk 300 miles across the desert to a place called Bosque Redondo. Leave behind everything you know. Your homes, your livestock, your sacred mountains, or be killed. This is the story of the Long Walk of the Navajo, one of the most traumatic events in Indigenous history, and one of the greatest stories of survival and resilience the world has ever known. To understand the Long Walk, you first have to understand what was taken. The Navajo homeland, known as Dineta, spans parts of what are now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. It is a land of red rock mesas, deep canyons, and sacred mountains. For sacred mountains mark the boundaries of the Navajo world. Cisnagini, the Blanca Peak in the east. Sudzil, the Mount Taylor in the south. Ducoastiad, the San Francisco Peaks in the west. And Dibnitsa, the Hesperus Peak in the north. For centuries, the Navajo people had lived within this sacred geography. They farmed in the canyons. They raised sheep on the mesas. They held their ceremonies at the sacred sites. They were a free people, living in a land that had sustained them for generations. The Navajo creation story tells how the people emerged from the earth and were given this land by the Holy Ones. It was not just a place to live. It was a sacred trust, a covenant between the people and the land itself. But by the 1860s, the United States wanted that land, and they were willing to do anything to get it. The man tasked with removing the Navajo was Colonel Kit Carson. In 1863, Carson launched a scorched earth campaign against the Navajo people that would become one of the most brutal military operations in American history. His soldiers burned homes. They destroyed crops. They slaughtered livestock. They poisoned wells. The goal was simple and cruel: starve the Navajo into submission. Carson's forces swept through the Navajo homeland like a plague. They burned thousands of ancient peach trees in Canyon de Chelly, trees that had been growing for generations, that had been planted by Navajo hands long before the Americans arrived. They destroyed cornfields and melon patches. They killed sheep and cattle by the thousands. They left nothing behind but ashes and bones. The Navajo had no choice. Without food, without shelter, they began to surrender. By the winter of 1864, thousands of Navajo had given up. They had no food, no shelter, no choice. And then came the order. Walk. The Long Walk began in the spring of 1864. Over 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forced to march 300 miles from their homeland to Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. They walked through desert. They walked through mountains. They walked with little food and little water. The elderly who could not keep up were left behind. Mothers who gave birth on the trail had to keep walking. Children who cried were told to be silent. Hundreds died along the way, from starvation, from exposure, from exhaustion, from heartbreak. The trail was marked with graves. Every mile, another body. Every mile, another family broken. The soldiers who guarded them were not kind. They pushed the people forward with whips and guns. Those who fell behind were shot or left to die. It was a death march, and the United States government called it relocation. Some Navajo were forced to walk more than one route. Different groups left from different points. Some walked for weeks. All of them suffered. All of them lost someone along the way. The Navajo remember the Long Walk the way other nations remember their greatest tragedies. It is seared into the collective memory of the people. It is told and retold. It is mourned and honored. And it is never forgotten. Bosque Redondo was supposed to be a reservation, a place where the Navajo would become farmers and live in peace. But the reality was a nightmare. The land was barren. The water was brackish and undrinkable. Crops failed year after year. The soil was alkaline and nothing would grow. The irrigation canals that the army built collapsed because the engineering was flawed. The wells they dug produced water that was too salty to drink. Disease spread through the camp like wildfire. Dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox, The Navajo were prisoners. They could not leave. They could not practice their ceremonies. They could not be who they were. For 4 years they suffered. And for 4 years they survived. The government had promised them a new home. What they got was a prison. The Mescalero Apache were already at Bosque Redondo, and the two groups did not get along. There were conflicts. There was violence. The army did nothing to protect either group. The people were left to suffer in a place that was never meant to sustain human life. The death toll at Bosque Redondo was staggering. Of the 8,000 Navajo who were forced to march there, over 2,000 died. That is 1 in 4. 1 in 4 people who had survived the long walk died at the reservation that was supposed to be their salvation. But the Navajo did not give up. They held onto their language. They held onto their songs. They held onto their identity. In secret, they practiced their ceremonies. They told their children the old stories. They remembered who they were. And they waited, because they knew someday they would go home. The conditions at Bosque Redondo were so bad that even the army officers began to admit the experiment was a failure. The Navajo were starving. They were sick. They were dying. The government had spent millions of dollars on the reservation, and nothing worked. The land would not produce. The water was poison. The people were wasting away. In 1868, after 4 years of suffering, the United States government finally admitted that Bosque Redondo was a failure. General William Tecumseh Sherman was sent to negotiate. And for once, the Navajo had a leader who would not be broken. His name was Barbancillo, and he changed everything. Barbancillo was a Navajo headman who had survived Bosque Redondo. When General Sherman offered to move the Navajo to a different reservation in Oklahoma, Barbancillo refused. He stood before the most powerful military figure in the United States and said words that would echo through history. "We will not go to any other place. We will return to our homeland." Sherman was stunned. He had expected the Navajo to accept any offer. But Barbancillo would not bend. He told Sherman that the Navajo had been promised a return to their homeland, and he intended to hold the government to that promise. After days of negotiation, Sherman agreed. On June 1, 1868, the Treaty of Bosque Redondo was signed. The Navajo were allowed to return home. It was one of the only times in American history that a defeated people were allowed to return to their homeland. And it happened because one man refused to accept anything less. Barbancillo's courage changed the course of Navajo history. Without him, the Navajo might have been scattered across Oklahoma, their connection to their sacred land severed forever. Instead, they went home. When the Navajo finally returned home, they found a land that had been scarred by war. Their homes were gone. Their fields were destroyed. Their livestock had been killed. But the land was still there. The sacred mountains still stood. The canyons still held their ancient stories. And the people were still alive. They rebuilt. They replanted. They started over. And they grew. Today, the Navajo Nation is the largest Native American reservation in the United States. Over 300,000 Navajo people call it home. They speak their language. They practice their ceremonies. They remember the long walk. And they honor those who walked so that they could live. The long walk teaches us something important. That no matter how far you are forced to walk, no matter how much you lose, home is always waiting. And the spirit of a people can never be broken. The Navajo proved that. They walked through hell. And they came home.